Hey, it's Dr. Crone here. Welcome to our video on race and ethnicity as it relates to politics. This is the first of two videos in our race, ethnicity, and gender unit, which is our last unit. So major shout out to you for making it this far in our online version of our course. We all probably have a conception of what the term race means, and it might be something like this textbook's definition. Your textbook definition says that race is the idea that human beings are divided into different groups, often thought of as biological categories, usually based on skin color. And your textbook makes sure to note that the biological basis is inaccurate. And that's true. Most people do think of race as being biologically determined, but this is actually not accurate. And scientists today agree that race is a social construction, a social categorization rather than a biological one. Your textbook has more information and references on that if you want to check that out. So the term racial formation then is a really important one, and we're going to call that also racialization, because that's the process through which ideas about supposed biological inferiority or superiority of groups of people based on skin color becomes important in politics, becomes important in society. Racial formation has significant political and social consequences. So racialization means basically the process by which social relationships in a society become structured based on the construct of race and racial categories. My example here, this picture, is from a children's book by Dr. Seuss about a society in which the dominant social class, the star-bellied Sneetches, discriminate against the lower social class, the plain-bellied Sneetches. For Sneetch society, having skin marked with a star grants social and political power. And I like to use that as an example because it's separated from our own conceptions of race and racial categories in our own society. So by the way, I'll give you 5 extra credit points if you read and review the book, The Sneetches, as an addition to your regular discussion board post. There are a number of YouTube readings on the book, and I recommend one by a guy named Mr. C. And I have linked that YouTube video on Blackboard if you wanna do that. So that's 5 extra credit points just for reading and reviewing this book, which it's more about individual discrimination, but it really does give that idea of what racialization would be like, that a certain biological characteristic is given political and social power. So the question of what causes a society to adopt racialization is very important in political science, and that's been very well studied for many years. And according to historians and social scientists, the number one cause of racialization all over the world was the European colonization of Africa and Latin America. So, and really of North America as well, in terms of racializing the indigenous people of North America as well. So as Europeans took over huge parts of sub-Saharan Africa and North and South America, the process of racialization really allowed them to justify their own political and economic dominance of these countries. So it became, oh, we're not robbing this country of its natural resources. We're quote unquote helping this inferior race. And they don't deserve this anyway. They're not smart enough to know what to do with their resources. We're going to, guide them because we are the superior race. So most social theories about the intellectual and biological inferiority of Black and Indigenous people come from this need that Europeans had in order to justify what were otherwise basically power grabs. So that's the number one cause of racialization in the world. There are other important causes as well. One is immigration. So when immigrants come to a country looking for economic resources, those in the dominant social group are often afraid because they see this competition for scarce resources, and therefore racialization becomes a way to dominate the immigrant group. A really good example of that happening were the Chinese and Japanese American immigration to the west coast of the US in the 1800s. So the Chinese especially came for railroad jobs, and that was a threat to actually both white and black the sort of lower class workers, and so racializing the Chinese as different and inferior was a way of pushing them farther down the ladder of economic success. Um, so competition for resources and immigration is probably a big cause. Another cause that Marxists speak about, this is really a theoretical framework for understanding race. What Marxists would say is that the capitalist class actually uses race to keep the working class divided. So in other words, they bank on the fact that racial hostility prevents oppressed workers from dominant racial groups from rising up in solidarity with workers of minority races. So in the United States, what a Marxist would say is, well, racial categories like Black, Mexican, or Hispanic, um, Asian, that prevents groups of people who all have the same economic self-interest from seeing that self-interest in working together in solidarity. So Marxists say race actually allows capitalists to keep exploiting workers. And this actually explains why leftist worker parties all across the world are usually strongly supportive of racial equality, and actually communist countries, for all of their many downfalls and autocratic ways, have been known or were known for strongly supporting both racial and gender equality. So South Africa gives us a good example of racialization in a country, and it kind of relates to the whole racialization of sub-Saharan Africa. So before European contact by the Dutch in the 1650s, South Africa, or the area that is South Africa today, was divided by tribal loyalties among various what we would call black Africans at the time. And so when the Dutch came and colonized South Africa, they began to make the distinction between whites and blacks, and what eventually became known as colored people, people of mixed race, or people of Indian ancestry who had been immigrants to South Africa from India. And South Africa has a really fascinating and bloody history of colonization. The Dutch eventually ceded control to the British, but there were enormous amounts of both British and Dutch Europeans who formed the white category in South Africa. So in South Africa around 1948, the Dutch heritage white citizens of South Africa formed a government based on apartheid, and notice that they were less than 20% of the population. And this was a system of control over people in the black category, who were by far the majority in the country, and also of other races. This apartheid system involved compulsory racial segregation into homelands, which weren't considered to actually be part of South Africa. So living in a homeland meant you weren't a citizen, you couldn't vote, you had to carry official identification, you had to not be in certain areas. A lot of professions were racially reserved. There were a lot of criminal laws regulating the behavior of natives, or what we would call blacks. There was a tremendous amount of economic exploitation and economic discrimination as well in these countries. So I've also linked just an optional video on more about South Africa, because we don't have time to go into that as much today. But if you would like to learn more about South Africa, you can. But the basic point here is that up until 1994, racialization in South Africa had enormous legal and also social consequences for people of the non-white, quote unquote, races. So we talk about race, we also talk about ethnicity, and there's some overlaps between the terms race and ethnicity, but mostly what they are distinct terms. So social scientists definitely make a distinction between race and ethnicity. So for social scientists, like comparative political scientists, an ethnic group is one that shares some sort of geographic origin and a national origin story or myth, which means it may or may not be 100% true, about how their group began. And they have a shared sense of historical things that have happened to their group and also a shared culture. Often this is a different language. The food, music, dance, arts, other things like that of the culture. Um, and that is an ethnic group when it is differentiated from other groups within the society. And your ethnicity means that you have a sense that you identify with that group. And the thing about ethnicity is it's much more fluid than race. It could be hyphenated. You could be a Japanese American or a European American or something where you have a feeling of identifying with more than one ethnic group. And this is different than race because race is something that is considered by society to not be changeable. It's based on your appearance, your skin color, and other appearances. It's unitary. You only have one race. Although these days we get more and more people identifying as biracial or multiracial. But for the most part, when race is politically important in a society, it is often unitary, and it's got some kind of intrinsic hierarchical notion to it that that being in one race is better than the other. Um, and then ethnicity is also it's different. Ethnicity is different than race, but it's also different than the concept of a nation. So we think of a nation as an ethnic group, but it goes beyond that into a group that sees itself as a political entity that deserves self-rule. It may or may not be self-ruling. Um, so for example, in France, the Basques are a nation, while Algerian immigrants in France are an ethnic group. The Basques are a nation because they historically have fought and striven to govern themselves both in Spain and in France. And they're frequently at odds with the French and Spanish government over issues of sovereignty in the areas where they are located. The Algerian community in France may have political interests, and certainly does, but it doesn't have that concept of wanting or deserving sovereign self-rule. So the distinction between race and ethnicity can be kind of confusing, and I ran across a quotation a couple of years ago that really helped me to understand the differences. So I'll just share it with you. This person says, "I have a friend who was born in Korea to Korean parents, but as an infant she was adopted by an Italian family in Italy. Ethnically, she feels Italian. This is her ethnicity. She eats Italian food, speaks Italian, knows Italian history and culture. She knows nothing about Korean history and culture. But when she comes to the United States, she's treated racially as Asian." And to be completely honest, in Italy, other than with her family, she's probably also treated as Asian there as well. And so that gets at the heart of, race is more about our appearance, and it's something that we don't understand in a society as being fluid, or that, like, I'm no longer Asian because I was raised in Italy. So racial empowerment is this concept of an ethnic group or a racial group rising up and demanding political equality. And so because of that, it's a really important term in political science. It's something that's people are very interested in researching right now. So it's the process by which there's a racial or ethnic group in a society that has been discriminated against, and they're trying to seek political solutions to their social problems. So that's what we would call racial empowerment. Um, and there are many, many examples all over the world. Certainly, the American Civil Rights Movement was a major harbinger of racial empowerment. But I tried to use some examples from all other places. The top is a picture of Bolivian indigenous people demanding rights and marching for those rights. We'll talk about Bolivia in just a second. Um, and the bottom picture is South Africa, protests in South Africa in the 1980s, I believe that's when that was from. Um, so racial empowerment can occur outside of the normal political process and often does through the development of social movements like the civil rights movement or like these pictures here. Or even through insurgencies or revolutions when you add violence into the mix. Um, or it can also happen within the normal system of politics, such as when racial or ethnic political parties are formed, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So racial empowerment generally has a set of common goals, no matter where we see it happening. So a group who is demanding equality is looking for various things: repeal of legal inequalities, such as things like American segregation or apartheid or segregation against the Bolivian indigenous peoples, things like that. Policies providing a path to economic and political equality beyond just legal inequality. So this could be things like jobs programs or assistance, educational assistance, or things like that. And then another important part of racial empowerment is recognition of that ethnic identity as a legitimate part of the nation's culture, rather than being a discriminated part or so. And this is where we get the ideas of multiculturalism, that all of the various ethnicities within a multi-ethnic country should be honored and legitimately looked at as a legitimate part of the culture rather than as a less important or inferior part of the nation's culture. So there's been a marked increase in the number of ethnic political parties, and that has been growing around the world since the early 2000s. And a lot of comparative political scientists are trying to answer the empirical puzzle of why ethnic political parties form in some countries and not in others. Like, why are there, if there's two multi-ethnic societies, why do some of them end up with these political parties and others don't? And we don't really know for sure yet why that's happening. There are a lot of people researching these things. Um, One key takeaway I want to say before I get started on the favorable conditions is just that in trying to explain why there's been such a growth of political parties like these ethnic parties since the 2000s, it seems to be related to the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism around the world, which has sort of broken up the traditional 1900s political cleavage between um, socialism and capitalism. So in many, many countries, there were Marxist or socialist parties struggling against, parties that represented more of a capitalist perspective. And since the fall of communism, a lot of that conflict has weakened and cracked that sort of traditional ideological cleavage, and that's opened up room for new cleavages, which seem to include ethnic and racial tensions that may have been unrepresented in previous party systems. So it's that sort of the quote-unquote end of ideology that has encouraged the growth of ethnic parties. So just some takeaways about why some countries have these parties and some don't. I kind of ran through the research pretty quickly and tried to look at newer things to share with you. Um, So favorable conditions for the development of an ethnic party seems to be first a country where ethnicity is seen as important, so if you have a country that's multi-ethnic, but ethnic identity is not a politically important issue, or doesn't, where you have more heterogeneity and representation already, you're probably not going to get an ethnic political party. So not only is ethnicity important in the social fabric of a society that develops these parties, but also at least one ethnic minority has experienced pretty significant social and political discrimination. So if you have that combination, and then not to mention what will make it even easier is if you have a multi-party system where proportional representation allows for a small ethnic party to gain some political power within the legislature. That's really going to be a favorable condition. So you're much less likely to see these in presidential systems or the winner-take-all type of systems than you are in a parliamentary proportional representation system. And then another favorable condition is there's no existing party that is trying to compete for representation of an ethnic minority. So if there is a peasants' party, for example, which there are in some Latin American countries, or a workers' party, like a socialist workers' party, they may siphon off that ethnic minority. And if those parties don't exist, that does also make it more favorable for an ethnic party to develop. So I want to leave you with an example of a country where an ethnic party or a multi-ethnic party actually has developed and taken over power, at least for a while. So Bolivia is a very interesting country, fascinating issues going on there right now. But in Bolivia, the ruling elite was always people who had the European lineage or the Spanish lineage, so sort of the what in America we would probably call Hispanic folk, but people who saw themselves as very much superior to the indigenous people of Bolivia, who are the majority. So it wasn't South African levels of discrimination, but it was very discriminatory. And starting in 1998, a party developed that was called the Movement Towards Socialism, led by Evo Morales. There's a picture of him, who is an indigenous person, what we in America would call a Native American. Um, and this was a combination of sort of a left-wing populist movement and a representation of discriminated against ethnic groups. So Morales took the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, very successful politically. He was able to integrate three groups, peasants, some of whom were of Spanish lineage, lowland and highland indigenous people. So these are people who are non-European, especially the highland natives have been there since prehistoric times, their lineage. And Evo Morales was able to put those together into a winning kind of coalition party called MAS. And he was elected president in 2006 and held on to that presidency for a very long time. He was taken down in, well, anyway, he left the presidency in 2019 amid accusations of corruption, of vote tampering in his election to his what would have been his fourth term, an unprecedented fourth term. Some interpretations of the Constitution of Bolivia said that wasn't allowed. So he was, depending on how you like your politics, he was either ousted for corruption or taken down in a coup by a party that mostly represents the European folks and Spanish lineage folks. He's still living in exile in Mexico, but his party still controls the legislature, even though the president, well, she's the acting president now, is not of that party and is actually a major rival of Morales's. So That's an example if you want to know a little bit more about that situation or see some pictures. I've also linked an optional video about with a little bit more of Bolivia. It's a short one, but it does have a lot of pictures of kind of his rise to power. So that's the end of our video lecture on race and ethnicity. There's one more lecture in this unit on gender and politics. So be sure to view both of them before you post in the discussion board. And remember, there's extra credit. See you next time.